Namaste. In the Western world, the observation that life comes from life was scientifically validated in the early to mid 1800s, and the term biogenesis was coined in 1870. The French chemist Louis Pasteur concluded that all life is from life, or in Latin, omni vivum ex vivo, while the German physician Rudolf Virchow verified that every cell comes from another cell, or in Latin, omnis cellula e cellula. Although such empirical conclusions overthrew the historic idea that life spontaneously generated from matter in the day-to-day reproductive sense, materialistically inclined scientists were and are still adamant about proving abiogenesis, that matter is the origin of life, exemplified by the statement of evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins that life is a, quote, happy chemical accident, end quote. Currently, synthetic biologist James Tour is making a tremendous push against scientists in the origin of life field who mislead the public into believing that either life has already been created from material building blocks in the lab, or that it will happen very soon. In a debate at Harvard University on November 28, 2023, against chemist Lee Cronin, who advocates abiogenesis, Dr. Tour highlighted several specific instances over the last 17 years when leading origin of life researchers make public announcements that their lab would create life in a test tube within 2 to 5 years. None of these came to fruition, and to be clear, life has never been created in the lab, although it is abundantly created in nature. Dr. Tour emphasized that molecules do not move towards life on their own. He cited several papers of Dr. Cronin's old work that demonstrate this point. Only when scientists forcefully try to assemble molecules to mimic structures that life effortlessly produces in mass quantity, the artificially assembled molecules start to slightly resemble bare-bone living materials. But these tend not to be sustainable. The observation that chemistry fights moving toward life is supported by observations by another prominent origin of life researcher, Steve Benner, although he still advocates abiogenesis. Dr. Benner admitted that, quote, chemistry is actually hard to get to work. The molecules precipitate, the molecules hydrolyze, the molecules decompose, and so it's very much a constraint that you have to deal with. It's one goddamn problem after another, end quote.
The question, of course, is what is life? And life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. Chemistry is actually hard to get to work. The molecules precipitate, the molecules hydrolyze, the molecules decompose. And so it's very much a constraint that you have to deal with when you're trying to create artificial genetic systems. And you got to keep in mind that I won't have a chance to talk about it, but all the hard work is in the synthetic and analytical chemistry, the developing of the enzymology for these and all the rest of it. And as we like to say, now that I can use Gary's use of language, is one goddamn problem after another.
What will it take for scientists to denounce the notion that life arises from matter? Based on historic example of modern science finally concluding that the perpetual motion machines were impossible to actually construct after centuries of strenuous attempts, a biomedical engineer named Rob Stadler suggested that contemporary scientists reach a similar conclusion about constructing life from non-life. Although Dr. Tour was reluctant to admit that current scientific evidence is sufficient to completely rule out abiogenesis at this point in time, Dr. Tour thought that much more data would have to be collected to effectively establish such a conclusion, but he did soberly recognize that scientists should at least acknowledge the possibility of abiogenesis being an incorrect premise for origin of life research. The scientist devotees at the Princeton Bhaktivedanta Institute appreciate this important work going on at the forefront of modern science today. As per the principles of the Institute was founded on in 1976, we continue dedicating time and energy to critically considering the evidence supporting biogenesis and the implications this has regarding life and cognition at the intersection of science, philosophy, and religion. Following 19th century scientists' recognition of biogenesis through mitosis of cells and sexual reproduction of organisms, 20th century spiritual leader Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada further emphasized that not only does life come from life, but also that matter comes from life. Srila Prabhupada famously pointed to the continual growth of fingernails to demonstrate the point, but the copious amounts of biomass, organic matter from recently deceased living entities, in addition to fossil fuels, tar, wax, and rubber or latex, also exemplify matter being created as a byproduct of the life cycle of living organisms. A more comprehensive account of how all matter in the universe comes from life results when we recognize the relationship between consciousness and matter. Pioneering quantum physicists throughout the 20th century recognized the observer effect, which is essentially empirical evidence validating that consciousness determines matter. Werner Heisenberg said that, quote, classical physics can be considered as that idealization in which we speak about the world as entirely separated from ourselves, while quantum theory does not allow a completely objective description of nature, end quote. And Werner Heisenberg also said that natural science does not simply describe and explain nature. It is a part of the interplay between nature and ourselves. It describes nature as exposed to our method of questioning. This was a possibility of which Descartes could not have thought, but it makes the sharp separation between the world and the I impossible, end quote. Another quantum physicist, John Archibald Wheeler, said that, quote, the universe does not exist out there independent of all acts of observation. Instead, it is in some strange sense a participatory universe, end quote. In 2021, in one of the world's leading journals in cosmology and astrophysics, American scientist Robert Lanza apparently showed that the very structure of space-time is determined by observers, both the gravitational constant and the effective cosmological constant. So there must be consciousness to actualize the potential of the world. Consciousness implies life, i.e., that there is a conscious living agent. German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel showed that the self-development of the absolute idea contains both life and consciousness, where life is the immediacy of spirit, where spirit's being in itself, and consciousness is the being for itself of spirit. When conceived in their maturity, life and consciousness are encompassed in the absolute idea, which is in and for itself. In this way, in addition to the more immediate observations of biomass and biomass derivatives previously discussed, we can clearly see that matter comes from life. We have also already established that life comes from life. These facts concerning consciousness, matter, and life constitute the law of biogenesis. So, empirical observation affirms the law of biogenesis, that life and matter come from life. From cells to organisms, living offspring only come from living parents. Following this a posteriori reasoning, or reasoning relating to or derived from observed facts, empirically observed facts, we must recognize that the origin of life is categorically different from natural life, while simultaneously maintaining an identity with it. Since new life necessarily depends on pre-existing life, and such pre-existing life also necessarily depended on other pre-existing lives, etc., then the original life from which this dynamic organic process unfurled must be independent of pre-existing life. The necessity for an original life arises from remaining consistent with the observation of biogenesis in nature. Clearly, pre-existing life exists prior in time to the resultant new life. Children appear later in time than parents. Thus, there is a linear succession of generations, one after another. Without an original life, we have an infinite regress of life forms with no starting point, thus indicating a circular process. Accommodating such a circular process without violating the linear succession of generations implies that the first life form or life forms in the sequence somehow spawn from the last life forms, while the last life depends on the first to initiate the living process that eventually led to its birth. The main issue here is that time travel would be necessary for the last life to give birth to the first, which is absurd for finite entities. Remaining consistent with the observation of biogenesis in nature necessarily compels us to rationally consider an independent, self-caused original life. This original life would depend on nothing but itself for its existence, while all other resultant life forms depend on it as the original causal agent. So far, this has been a posteriori reasoning, originally derived from empirical observation. However, we have reached a turning point. Continuing to unbiasedly pursue the path of reason in consideration of how something can be the cause of itself requires a shift from sensuous thinking to conceptual thinking. In order to continue making progress here, we must embrace philosophy. A dutiful commitment to soberly and comprehensively explaining natural phenomena requires that we move beyond the senses into the milieu of pure thought and reason. Dr. Bhaktivedanta Puri, serving director of the Princeton Bhaktivedanta Institute, succinctly recognized that, quote, text without context is the pretext of knowledge. One of the greatest limitations of scientific thinking is the inability of scientists to understand the fallacy of context-free analysis, end quote. Dr. Puri also articulated that, quote, thought and thing are etymologically related. They are also ontologically related, end quote. So the context of everything is thought. The original life and all resultant natural life are an identity in difference. They are identical in quality, but different in quantity, similar to the sun and the photons that reach Earth. Photons have the same potency as the sun since they originate from it, but that potency is manifest to a much smaller degree. The original life must be completely independent of other influences. Otherwise, we get into the mess of accommodating a circular process without violating the linear succession of generations previously described. Thus, the original life is self-determined, absolute, and infinite. On the other hand, natural life is intrinsically dependent on its origin and environment. Thus, it is relative and finite. Historically, this absolute, infinite, self-determined first cause is known to be God. Western philosopher Baruch Spinoza elucidated the concept of self-causation, or in Latin, causa sui, as God. It is notable that Albert Einstein professed belief in Spinoza's God. Interestingly, René Descartes also soberly engaged with the idea of God as self-caused. This concept has been known in the East since ancient times, as evident from the Vedic text Brahma Samhita, verse 5.1. Ishvaraha Paramaha Krishnaha Satchidananda Vigraha Anadir Adir Govindaha Sarva Karana Karanam. The Supreme Lord, the embodiment of truth, consciousness, and joy, is Govinda, Krishna. He is beginningless, the origin of all that be, and the cause of all causes. If the systematic development of reason, starting from sober observations of nature, leads to theology, then it must be accepted as a necessary and scientific conclusion. Authorities on Vedic knowledge, like Srila Bhakti Rakshak Sridhara Dev-Goswami Maharaj, who is called Shastra Nipunsa, or a scriptural genius by his esteemed guru, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, verified that the law of biogenesis is agreeable with what the Vedantic view presents. Thus, our conclusion of the relevance of the law of biogenesis to thoughtful research at the intersection of science, philosophy, and religion applies both to Western and Eastern thought. In summary, research based on abiogenesis has attempted on several occasions to convince the public that life has been created de novo in the lab, but it has not. Thus, insightful synthetic chemists are pushing back against this misleading hype. On the other hand, the law of biogenesis is empirically observed every day. Life and matter come from life. This necessarily leads to a posteriori reasoning that recognizes the origin of life as categorically different from natural life, while simultaneously being identical with it. This requires dialectic metaphysics to properly comprehend, such as that of Hegel or Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's Achintya Bheda Abheda Tattva. Unlike natural life, which is always dependent on other pre-existing lives, the original life is independent of pre-existing life. It is self-caused, sarva karana karanam. The thoughtful recognition and exposition of the transcendent qualities and activities of this self-caused absolute idea, which is subject as much as substance, i.e., divine personality, constitute the framework of a science of spirit.